The road to Bhangarh Fort twisted like a dying serpent through the Aravalli hills, its path lined with gnarled trees that clawed at the sky. The SUV rumbled over uneven terrain as Aarav checked the time. 5:37 p.m. The sun was already slipping behind the hills, casting long shadows over the ruins. "Last chance to turn back," said their guide, an elderly man named Raghav, his voice grim. "Once the sun sets, no one should remain inside." Aarav glanced at his team. Riya, the fearless journalist, Kabir, their skeptical tech expert, and Meera, the quiet but intuitive researcher. They had come to document the truth about Bhangarh, to separate myth from reality. Ghost stories were great for clicks, but Aarav wasn't here for views. He wanted answers. "We'll be fine," Riya assured the old man, her camera already rolling. "Let's just get inside before dark." Raghav shook his head but led them to the crumbling entrance. A massive sign stood before them, rusted at the edges. "Entering Bhangarh after sunset is strictly prohibited. Government of India." The warning sent a chill down Aarav's spine. The moment they stepped inside, the air thickened. The ruins stretched before them, silent and lifeless, yet something felt aware. The fort walls bore scars of time, cracked stone whispering tales of its bloody past. "Anyone else feel that?" Kabir muttered, rubbing his arms. "It's like the air's heavier here." "It's just the atmosphere." Meera replied, though her voice wavered. "Let's get moving." The group ventured deeper. Unseen eyes seemed to follow them, the weight of the past pressing down. And then from the heart of the ruins, a voice drifted through the air, soft, melodic, and heartbreakingly sad. A woman's voice. Riya's camera flickered. The temperature plummeted. And then the whisper became a laugh. A cold, hollow laugh that echoed through the cursed ruins. The laughter slithered through the air, curling around them like unseen fingers. It wasn't human. It wasn't natural. It was everywhere. Riya gasped and stumbled backward, clutching her camera like a lifeline. The device's screen flickered, distorted static and shadowy shapes twisting in the pixels. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Hear it?" Kabir rasped. "It was right next to me." Aarav's skin prickled. The ruins had been dead silent just seconds ago. Now, the air felt charged, electric with something unseen. He forced himself to scan the darkness pooling in the corners of the fort, his flashlight barely piercing the gloom. The towering walls loomed like decayed sentinels, and the ground beneath them felt wrong, as if it had soaked in centuries of pain. Meera clutched her notebook to her chest, her wide eyes reflecting the fading light. "We should go," she murmured. "Right now." But then, footsteps. Soft, deliberate, just ahead. Aarav swung his flashlight toward the ruined archway before them. The beam sliced through the darkness and landed on something standing there, a figure, tall, draped in a tattered sari that fluttered despite the dead air. Her face was hidden in shadow, but her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if her neck had been broken. And then she moved, not walked, not stepped, shifted. 1 second she was beneath the archway, the next, closer. The breath in Aarav's lungs turned to ice. Kabir sucked in a ragged breath. "No! No!" The woman jerked forward, her broken body dragging toward them, her bare feet never touching the ground. Her whisper slithered into their ears, wrapping around their skulls like a noose. "Go back! Go back! Go back!" The last word was a shriek, inhuman, deafening, filled with all the agony of the souls that had perished here. The ruins came alive, the walls groaned. Shadows deepened. The air turned suffocating. And then the first scream ripped through the night. Someone from their group was missing. The scream tore through the night like a blade through flesh. It came from behind them, raw, terrified, and then gone. Aarav spun around, his heart hammering. "Kabir?" His own voice felt weak against the crushing silence that followed. No answer. Riya turned in frantic circles, her camera jerking wildly. "Where is he? He was right here." Meera's breath hitched as she pointed toward the ground. Aarav followed her shaking hand, his stomach turned to ice. A trail of footprints, Kabir's, leading away from them. But they weren't normal. They staggered like he had been dragged or had walked against his will. The last footprint ended abruptly. No body, no blood, just emptiness. And then, thud, a sound above them. Slow, deliberate, like something shifting its weight on the crumbling rooftop of the fort. Aarav's fingers tightened around his flashlight. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted. The others were frozen too, their breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Riya slowly tilted her camera upward. The lens caught movement, a shadow against the pale moonlight. Something crouched there, its limbs too long, its form distorted as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Then a flicker of movement, and two eyes opened, black, deep, endless. A rasping breath shuddered through the air, and then Kabir's voice, but wrong, stretched, twisted. "Help me." The thing dropped from above. The silence after the fall was suffocating. Dust curled around their feet, rising in thick clouds as the shape on the ground twitched. Aarav's flashlight trembled in his grasp, its weak glow flickering over the crumpled figure. Kabir's shirt, Kabir's body. But something was wrong. His limbs were bent at strange angles like a puppet with its strings cut. His head tilted too far to one side, his chin nearly touching his shoulder. Then slowly, his fingers began to curl. Riya's breath hitched. "Kabir?" A sound escaped his throat, a wheezing, rattling gasp, as if his lungs had forgotten how to breathe. His fingers dug into the stone beneath him. Then in a single, unnatural motion he stood. Aarav took an instinctive step back. The dim light cast Kabir's face in shadows, but his eyes, they were open now, wide, unblinking. But there was something in them that didn't belong. Meera reached for him hesitantly. "Kabir?" His mouth moved, but the voice that came out was not his own. "You should have never come." The air shifted, the ruins groaned, shadows thickened around them, and then, deep within the fort, something else began to move. The laughter rose like a plague, slithering through the ruins, multiplying. It came from the walls, the ground, the air itself, low, guttural, crawling into their ears, under their skin, inside their bones. Aarav staggered back, his flashlight trembling. "This isn't real," he whispered, but his voice was lost beneath the chorus of them. The creature in Kabir's clothes took a step forward, its joints popping like shattered glass. The smile on its face stretched, impossibly wide, the skin splitting at the corners of its mouth. "You should have never come." Riya let out a strangled scream, gripping her camera like it was her only lifeline. Meera was frozen, her lips moving silently, praying, or maybe begging. And then, in the distance, shapes began to emerge. More figures. Dozens, no hundreds. Drifting out from the ruins, from the archways, from the cursed shadows where the sun had long since died. Silhouettes of men and women, their bodies twisted, their faces obscured. But their eyes black, hollow voids glowed with a sickening hunger. The air turned thick, heavy with the stench of rot and something older, something worse. One of the figures lurched forward, closer than before. Then another, then another. The laughter did not stop. Aarav's breath came in ragged gasps. "Run," he croaked. No one moved. "Run!" And then the things charged. They ran. Aarav's legs burned as he sprinted through the ruins, the ancient stone paths twisting like a maze designed to trap them. The laughter had stopped, but the silence was worse. It meant the things behind them were waiting, watching. Meera gasped for air beside him, clutching her notebook as if it could protect her. Riya ran ahead, her camera still clutched in a death grip, its red recording light blinking in the darkness. But Kabir... Aarav stole a glance over his shoulder. Kabir was moving, but not like before. His body jerked with each step like a puppet on invisible strings. His head twitched side to side, his unblinking eyes locked on them. And then he laughed. A sound that didn't belong to him, a sound that belonged to the things that hunted them. "He's not Kabir anymore," Riya shrieked. Aarav didn't look back again. He couldn't. Up ahead, the ruins opened into a courtyard, dark, empty, the remnants of a once grand palace looming over them like a decayed skeleton. The only way out was through it. Meera hesitated. No, we can't go in there." "Do you want to stay out here?" Riya snapped. Meera swallowed hard. Then they ran inside. The air inside the palace was different, heavier. The moment they crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted. A thick, suffocating cold wrapped around Aarav's throat, squeezing the air from his lungs. Then, a whisper, not from Kabir. Not from outside, from above. Aarav's flashlight flickered upward, and his heart stopped. They weren't alone. Something was crawling along the ceiling. The scream tore through the night like a blade through flesh. It came from behind them, raw, terrified, and then gone. Aarav spun around, his heart hammering. "Kabir?" His own voice felt weak against the crushing silence that followed. No answer. Riya turned in frantic circles, her camera jerking wildly. "Where is he? He was right here." Meera's breath hitched as she pointed toward the ground. Aarav followed her shaking hand, his stomach turned to ice. a trail of footprints, Kabir's, leading away from them. But they weren't normal. They staggered like he had been dragged or had walked against his will. The last footprint ended abruptly. No body, no blood, just emptiness. And then, thud, a sound above them, slow, deliberate, like something shifting its weight on the crumbling rooftop of the fort. Aarav's fingers tightened around his flashlight. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet stayed rooted. The others were frozen too, their breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Riya slowly tilted her camera upward. The lens caught movement, a shadow against the pale moonlight. Something crouched there, its limbs too long, its form distorted as if it didn't quite belong in this world. Then a flicker of movement, and two eyes opened, black, deep, endless. A rasping breath shuddered through the air, and then Kabir's voice, but wrong, stretched, twisted. "Help me." The thing dropped from above. The doors slammed with a force that shook the ancient walls, sending dust cascading from the ceiling. The air turned thick, suffocating, as if the palace itself was alive and closing in. Aarav yanked at the heavy wooden doors, locked, sealed shut by something unseen. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Help me," he gasped. Riya and Meera rushed to his side, their fingers scrabbling against the old wood, pushing, pulling, nothing. Behind them the thing on the ceiling shifted, a slow, deliberate crackling of bones, then a sound, a whisper, a rasp, a voice curling through the darkness like dead fingers on their skin. "Why do you run?" Aarav turned, his flashlight casting its weak, flickering glow upward. The thing was descending, not dropping, lowering. Its limbs stretched, its body bending as it slithered down the stone wall, slow and deliberate, savoring every second. Its fingers flexed, nails scraping against the surface, sending a shiver of unbearable sound through the chamber. Riya whimpered, her back pressed against the locked doors. "This isn't real. This isn't real." The thing's head twitched. Then it laughed, a jagged, fractured sound that made the walls vibrate. "It is real." Then it lunged. The thing launched itself from the wall. A blur of jagged limbs and twisted flesh, it came fast, moving in unnatural, broken jerks. Its mouth, too wide, too hungry, snapped open, revealing blackened teeth that dripped with something thick and wrong. Aarav shoved Meera aside as the creature slammed into the spot where she had been standing a second before. The impact cracked the stone floor, dust billowing around them. The air reeked of damp earth, of something ancient and rotting. Riya screamed as she backed against the locked doors, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's not human! It's not human!" The thing twitched, then rose, slowly, too slowly, its body bent at unnatural angles, its limbs unfolding like a spider rearranging itself, and its eyes, those hollow, hungry pits, fixed on them once more. No more running. Then it charged again. Aarav grabbed the first thing he could, a rusted iron torch holder, and swung. The metal connected with a sickening crack. The creature reeled back, its laughter warping into a distorted screech. But it didn't fall. It didn't stop. It only laughed harder. The walls trembled, the shadows around them shifted, and from the darkness beyond the chamber, more shapes began to stir. They were not alone. The laughter didn't stop. It spread. From the shadows beyond the chamber, more figures began to move, slithering from the cracks in the stone, emerging from the darkness like rotting memories. Their faces blurred, shifting like smoke, but their eyes were fixed on the living. Aarav's fingers tightened around the rusted torch holder, his knuckles white. The creature he had struck twitched, its bones clicking back into place. It should have been hurt. It wasn't. The other things, dozens of them now, closed in, their laughter a symphony of madness. Some dragged their fingers along the walls, carving deep gashes into the ancient stone. Others simply stood, their heads lolling unnaturally as if waiting for something. Meera clutched her notebook to her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "What do they want?" Riya's camera flickered, the red recording light pulsing weakly. "They want us." The creature in front of them tilted its head, the movement slow, deliberate, its mouth stretched open too wide, its jaw unhinging with a grotesque pop. "You cannot leave." Then the lights went out, total darkness. Aarav's breath hitched. He couldn't see his own hand. He couldn't see the others. He couldn't see them. Then in the blackness, whispers, right beside his ear, "We see you." And then something touched him. Aarav froze. The touch wasn't warm. It wasn't human. It was cold, seeping through his skin, crawling into his bones. Fingers thin, brittle, like dried vines, brushed against his arm. Then they tightened. Aarav jerked away, stumbling back. His heart pounded so hard it threatened to crack his ribs. "Riya, Meera!" He gasped into the suffocating darkness. No answer, only the whispers. "We see you. We feel you. You are ours." A breath, hot and rancid, brushed against his neck. Then laughter. Aarav swung the torch holder blindly, the metal slicing through the dark. It hit nothing. The cold fingers vanished, retreating into the void. Then a sound, a slow, sickening dragging. He turned. A dim, flickering light, Riya's camera, blinked weakly in the distance, and in its glow he saw them. Riya and Meera, being pulled away, their feet scraped against the ground as unseen hands dragged them backward, their fingers clawing at the stone. Their eyes were wide, pleading, their mouths open in silent screams, and the things around them, those twisted figures, were smiling. Aarav lunged forward, reaching for them, and the floor collapsed beneath him. He fell. Aarav's scream was swallowed by the dark as he plunged downward. The air rushed past him, stone and dust tearing at his skin. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he was alive, barely. Above him, the hole in the floor was gone, sealed as if it had never been there. The only sign of what had happened was the distant echo of Riya and Meera's screams, fading, being dragged deeper into the ruins. Aarav tried to move, but the air was thick. Wrong. Something was breathing down here, a deep, slow inhale. Then, an even slower exhale. He wasn't alone. The dim glow of his flashlight flickered on, casting a weak, trembling beam across the chamber. The walls were ancient, covered in blackened carvings, symbols that pulsed as if they were alive. The air hummed with something unseen, something hungry. Then, movement, a slithering sound, wet, heavy, something massive shifting in the dark. Aarav's grip tightened on his flashlight. He turned the beam and froze. Eyes, so many eyes, lining the walls, embedded in the stone, watching him. And then, slowly, they blinked. A voice, deep, guttural, ancient, rumbled from the darkness. "You have come to the cursed place." A shape stirred. Aarav couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then it began to rise. The darkness shifted. The air grew thick, pressing against Aarav's chest, crushing the breath from his lungs. The thing in the shadows, massive, ancient wrong, began to rise. The eyes embedded in the walls blinked in unison. The stone itself groaned, like the fort was awakening from a nightmare. Aarav staggered backward, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam barely pierced the blackness, but then, a glimpse. Arms. Too many, folding and unfolding like the limbs of a centipede. A face, or what should have been one, shifting, melting, forming and unforming. Its skin was like rotting silk, stretched too thin over something that wasn't meant to be seen. And its eyes, not human, not anything he could understand. Deep pits of swirling shadow filled with something that moved. The voice came again, low, guttural, filling the chamber like a sickness. "You are in my domain now." Aarav ran. His legs screamed in protest, his ribs burning with every breath. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. The walls shifted around him, the tunnels twisting, stretching, changing. The fort itself was alive, playing with him. Then a sound behind him, a deep, wet scraping. The thing was following. It wasn't running. It didn't need to. The air itself dragged him back like invisible hands clawing at his skin. The whispers returned. "You cannot run. You belong to us." And then, up ahead, Aarav saw it. A door, ancient, heavy, slightly open. He lunged for it, and something grabbed his ankle. Aarav's breath came in short, sharp gasps. His body ached, his mind screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, trapped under the weight of unseen terror. The figure in the corner didn't move like a person. It didn't step forward. It simply shifted, as if the darkness itself was folding and unfolding around it. Its form was hazy, hard to define, yet its presence was suffocating. Then the whisper. "You shouldn't have come." Aarav scrambled backward, his fingers scraping against the cold stone floor. His flashlight was still on the other side of the door, gone. He was alone in near darkness, with only the dim glow of an ancient oil lamp flickering from the walls. The figure moved again, not walking, drifting. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and though Aarav couldn't make out its face, he could feel its gaze boring into him. "Where are your friends?" the voice murmured, curling around him like mist. Aarav's stomach twisted. Meera, Riya. They were still up there, in the fort, with those things. He had to find them. Summoning every ounce of strength left in him, he forced himself to his feet. "Who are you?" His voice barely came out a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lifted one hand, long, slender fingers pointing toward a darkened tunnel on the far side of the room. "Go!" Aarav hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to run the other way, but there was no other way. The door behind him had sealed shut. His only choice was forward. Swallowing his fear, he stepped toward the tunnel. The moment he did, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. And then, just before it disappeared completely, it whispered one final warning: "Do not look back." Aarav stepped into the tunnel, his breath uneven, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The air was heavy, stale, thick with the scent of damp stone and something older. The oil lamp's dim glow barely reached the edges of the walls, leaving endless darkness ahead. The last words of the figure echoed in his mind: "Do not look back." The passage twisted, narrowing as he moved deeper. The silence was unnatural, no wind, no echoes of his own footsteps, only the sound of his breathing. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around, to make sure nothing followed, but he didn't. He wouldn't. Then a sound, soft at first, a slow, deliberate tapping. Aarav's pulse spiked. It was behind him. The sound grew louder, closer, a rhythmic click, click against the stone floor, like nails or bones scraping along the ground. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to walk faster. His mind screamed at him to run, but the warning still held him in its grip. "Do not look back." The tapping stopped. Silence. Then breathing. Not his own. It was right behind him. Aarav's throat clenched. The air turned cold, brushing against the back of his neck like an unseen hand. He could feel something standing there, looming just beyond the edges of his vision. Then a whisper, soft, closer than before. "Why won't you look at me?" Aarav bolted. He ran, ignoring the burning in his legs, his ribs screaming in protest. The tunnel twisted and turned, stretching into endless black. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The whisper came again, almost mocking. "You're almost there, but they won't be." Aarav's chest tightened. Meera, Riya. The tunnel suddenly widened, opening into a vast chamber. A single archway stood at the far end, carved with ancient symbols that pulsed faintly in the dark. A way out. But just as he reached it, cold fingers brushed against the back of his neck. Aarav lunged forward, his body propelled by pure terror. The archway loomed ahead, its carved symbols flickering in the dim light. He had to reach it. He had to get out. But the hand, that thing, had already touched him. A cold sensation spread down his spine as if something had marked him. His skin prickled, his breath hitched. The air behind him shifted, and though he still refused to turn, he could feel it. Something was leaning in. "You were never meant to leave." The whisper curled around his ears, too close, too real. Aarav lunged through the archway, and the world changed. He hit the ground hard, his palms scraping against grass. The damp, cold stone was gone. Instead, the scent of earth filled his nose. A soft wind brushed against his skin. He gasped, blinking against the sudden shift. And then he realized he was outside. He turned his head, and his blood ran cold. Bhangarh Fort stood before him, its ruined towers silhouetted against the moon. He had escaped the tunnels, the underground horror, the thing that had been following him. But something was wrong. The fort looked different. More intact, the walls taller, the structures whole. It wasn't the abandoned ruin he had entered. It was as if he had stepped into another time. Then, "Aarav!" His heart leapt. Meera's voice. He turned sharply, scanning the darkness. "Meera?" He took a step forward, his pulse hammering. Then another voice, soft, familiar. "Aarav, don't move." His breath froze. It was Riya. But something about her voice was wrong. Slowly, very slowly, Aarav looked down and realized the shadow beneath him wasn't his own. Aarav's breath caught in his throat. The shadow beneath him stretched unnaturally, its edges wrong, its movements independent of his own. He lifted his foot slightly. His real shadow should have followed. It didn't. Instead it twitched, shifted. Then it looked up at him. Aarav stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. But the shadow didn't stay on the ground. It rose. Like liquid darkness peeling off the earth, it lifted itself into the air, inhaling, stretching into a shape that was almost human, but not quite. No features, no face, just a writhing silhouette that pulsed and flickered like a flame. Then it spoke. "You were never alone." The voice was his own. Aarav ran. The night felt wrong, stretched too thin, like reality itself was bending around him. The wind howled through the ruins, whispering in a language he didn't understand. Aarav! Meera's voice again, somewhere up ahead, desperate, close. His feet pounded against the ground as he raced forward. The stone corridors twisted and turned, yet he knew he was getting closer. Then, movement. A figure stumbled into view. Meera. Her hair was disheveled, her face streaked with dirt, but it was her. She turned sharply, eyes wide with panic. Aarav! He almost collapsed in relief. Meera, where's Riya? Meera opened her mouth to answer, and then she stopped. Her face paled. Her eyes locked onto something behind him. Aarav didn't want to turn. He knew what he would see. But the air had changed. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against his back. Meera took a step backward, shaking her head in silent horror, and then she screamed. Aarav felt his body lock up. Meera's scream tore through the night, raw and full of terror. He didn't turn. He couldn't. Every nerve in his body told him that if he did, if he looked at whatever was behind him, it would be too late. But then the whisper came again. Aarav. His name, stretched thin, spoken in his own voice. Cold air brushed against the back of his neck, as if something was breathing right there. Close. Too close. Meera's eyes widened in horror. She backpedaled, her voice trembling. Aarav, don't move, don't. Then something touched his shoulder. Ice-cold fingers. Aarav snapped. He spun around, and the world tilted. Darkness. Aarav wasn't standing anymore. He was falling, spiraling downward into a black void with no end. His screams echoed around him, swallowed by the abyss. Then a hand shot out of the dark. It grabbed his wrist, yanking him back into the world. Aarav gasped, his body hitting solid ground. He blinked rapidly, heart hammering. He was back in Bhangarh Fort, but something was different. The ruins around him looked older, untouched by time. The night sky above was darker, deeper, with stars that didn't belong. The air itself felt thicker, charged with something ancient. Then he heard it, a sound he should not be hearing. A bell, a deep, resonant temple bell ringing from somewhere inside the fort. But Bhangarh had no working temples. Not anymore. Aarav wasn't in his own time anymore, and he was not alone. The deep chime of the temple bell sent shivers down Aarav's spine. It echoed through the night, vibrating in the air as if it was summoning something. He turned in frantic circles, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The fort was different. No broken walls, no crumbling pillars. Everything stood whole, bathed in an eerie glow under the alien night sky. This isn't real. This isn't real, Aarav whispered to himself. Then, footsteps. Slow, measured, deliberate. They came from behind him. Aarav clenched his fists. He knew what happened when he looked back. But he wasn't falling this time. He was here, wherever here was. He took a deep breath and turned around. A woman stood before him, draped in a dark sari, her face hidden beneath a deep veil. She was tall, unnaturally still. Even the fabric of her clothes didn't move, despite the cold wind. She raised a single hand, pale, delicate fingers pointing to the temple that should not exist. Aarav swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The woman didn't respond, but her veil shifted, as if something underneath was moving. Then she spoke. The curse must be completed. Aarav took a step back. "What curse? What are you talking about?" The temple bell rang again. The woman twitched, a sudden, unnatural jerk of her body, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled. Then, in a voice not her own, she whispered, "They're already here." Aarav's stomach dropped. The air behind him changed. A presence, a weight, many of them, gathering in the darkness. He turned just in time to see the shadows at the edge of the temple come alive. Aarav's breath hitched as the darkness at the temple's edge stirred. At first it was just a ripple, like ink swirling in water. Then the blackness shifted, taking shape, rising into twisted forms that barely resembled human figures. They were tall, too tall. Their limbs were elongated, their movements jerky, like puppets on invisible strings. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, watching him with faces that weren't there. They moved. Aarav staggered back, his pulse hammering. The woman in the veil remained still, unmoving, as if she belonged to this nightmare. "The curse must be completed," she whispered again. Aarav's mouth was dry. What does that mean?" The figures lurched forward. The ground beneath Aarav's feet quaked, as if the very earth rejected his presence. The temple bell rang louder, each chime vibrating in his bones. And then the whispers started, not from the woman, not from the shadows, from inside his own head. You don't belong here. She waits for you. Run, run, run. Aarav bolted. His feet pounded against the ancient stone paths, the air around him thick with something wrong. The shadows chased him, their movements silent, unnatural, gliding faster than they should. He didn't look back. He wouldn't. The temple loomed ahead, its massive wooden doors slightly open. A flickering light pulsed from within. Aarav didn't think. He lunged forward, bursting through the entrance, and the doors slammed shut behind him. The whispers stopped. The temple was silent. Aarav collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. His eyes darted around the dimly lit chamber. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, the walls adorned with carvings that seemed to move when he wasn't looking directly at them. Then, a voice. "You shouldn't have come here, Aarav." His head snapped up. A figure stood at the far end of the temple, half hidden in the shadows, and Aarav felt his blood freeze. It was Riya, but something was wrong with her eyes. Arav's breath caught. Riya stood at the far end of the temple, her body half hidden in the flickering torchlight. She was still wearing the same clothes from earlier that night, but something was wrong. Her posture was too stiff, her head tilted ever so slightly, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Then her eyes, they were empty. Not like she was blind, not like she was staring through him. There was nothing inside them. Just two dark, hollow voids stretching too deep, as if looking into them would swallow him whole. "Riya," Aarav whispered, his voice barely holding steady. She didn't blink, didn't move. The torches flickered, their light dancing against the stone walls. Then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she spoke. "You left me behind." Aarav felt his stomach drop. "What?" She took a slow step forward. Her feet barely made a sound against the temple floor. The carvings on the walls twitched, shifting like something alive within the stone. "You left me," she repeated, her voice sharper, angrier. "You ran. You didn't look back." Aarav didn't move. His mind raced, his pulse hammering. This wasn't Riya. It couldn't be. What if it was? He swallowed hard. "Where's Meera?" Riya froze. The air in the temple changed. Then her mouth split into a grin. Not a smile, not relief, a grin that stretched too wide, her lips cracking, her teeth too sharp. "She's still with them." Aarav's blood turned to ice. Then the torches went out, total darkness. Then a whisper right next to his ear, "And now so are you." Aarav couldn't breathe. The torches had died in an instant, plunging the temple into total blackness. The air was thick, suffocating, alive with something unseen. Then, the sound, a whispering slither, like something crawling along the walls. The carvings moved, shifting in the dark, their stone bodies writhing as if trying to break free. And Riya, she was still there. Her voice came from everywhere at once. The hollow black voids of her eyes burned into his mind, though he could no longer see her. Then, a hand wrapped around his wrist, ice cold, fingers too long, nails like splintered bone. Aarav jerked away, but it didn't let go. Instead it pulled him backward. His body slammed into something, soft, not stone, not wood, something breathing. His scream barely left his lips before more hands grabbed him, cold and clawed, dragging him down. Aarav fell, not through air, not through stone, through something else. It was like sinking into thick, living tar. Shapes moved around him, faces flickering in the dark, mouths opening in silent screams. Then, a voice, soft, old. "You have seen too much." Aarav's stomach lurched. Then, the ground returned. His body slammed against cold stone, knocking the air from his lungs. His vision swam, his head throbbing. He gasped for breath, scrambling up. He was in a different place. The temple was gone. He was back inside Bhangarh Fort, but not as he knew it. The walls were bleeding. Thick black liquid oozed from the cracks, crawling toward him like hungry vines. The air hummed with whispers, voices overlapping in a language he didn't understand. Then, the sound of bare feet on stone. Slow, deliberate. Aarav turned his head. A woman stood at the far end of the corridor. Not Riya, not Meera, someone else, someone who should not be here. Aarav's body was frozen. His mind screamed for him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The woman at the end of the corridor was watching him. She was tall, draped in heavy, ancient garments, her face half hidden behind a golden veil. Her presence was wrong, as if she were both there and not there at the same time. And then she moved. Not by stepping forward, but by gliding, her feet never touching the stone. The black liquid oozing from the walls parted around her, as if terrified of her presence. Aarav's throat clenched, His pulse pounded. Then she spoke. The curse must be completed. Aarav's mouth went dry. What curse? What do you want from me? The woman tilted her head. The golden veil shifted, revealing the lower half of her face. Her lips were cracked, ancient, as if time itself had forgotten to touch her. You do not belong here, yet you walked into our story. The whispers around him rose, the walls shuddering, the air thickened, pressing down on his chest. Aarav, his head snapped to the side. Meera and Riya were there, but they were changed. Their bodies flickered, half real, their eyes dark voids like Riya's had been before. They weren't fully here. Leave, Meera's voice trembled, before she takes you too. Aarav's stomach dropped. The woman's veil shifted further, revealing more of her face, skin that wasn't human anymore but cracked like old porcelain. She lifted a hand, and shadows rose behind her. Dozens of them, twisted, hollow-eyed creatures, the souls of those who had never left Bhangarh. You walked into our curse. Aarav felt it, the air pulling at him, as if reality itself was rejecting his presence. Now you must take their place. The shadows lunged. Aarav ran. The corridor twisted around him, the walls stretching and groaning, as if the fort itself was alive. The shadows swarmed, their hollow faces grinning as they reached for him. You cannot leave. The woman's voice echoed through the air, everywhere at once. Meera and Riya's figures flickered, torn between the world of the living and the cursed ruins. Aarav! Meera screamed. The exit! Find the exit! Aarav's mind snapped into focus. The archway. The way he had come in. He turned a sharp corner, feet pounding against the stone, but the fort had changed. The passageways twisted into a labyrinth of endless ruins, doorways where there had been none, walls where there had been paths. No, 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 Aarav gasped, his pulse hammering. Then, a whisper in his ear, break the curse. Aarav skidded to a halt, his chest heaved. Break the curse. That was the only way out. His eyes snapped to the woman in the golden veil. She stood still, watching him, waiting. He suddenly understood. This was her curse. The curse of Ratnavati, the queen who had been doomed to haunt these ruins forever. The curse that trapped every soul that wandered in, and she needed a new soul to take her place. Aarav's gaze darted to Riya and Meera. They were fading, their bodies nearly swallowed by the creeping dark. He had to make a choice, his life or theirs. Aarav turned to the queen. Take me. The fort shuddered. The golden-veiled woman tilted her head, as if considering his words. The shadows froze. Then she smiled. Darkness exploded around him. The fort stood silent. Meera and Riya woke up outside the ruins, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling. The night sky stretched above them, empty and still. But Aarav was gone. The doors of Bhangarh Fort were sealed once more, and deep within the ruins a figure stood in the shadows, watching, waiting. The curse had a new keeper, and Bhangarh Fort was hungry for more.